In 1957, Brazilian farmer Antonio Boas said something not from this world landed in his field and took him. His story was mocked, then buried. Decades later, photos surfaced online showing soldiers surrounding a crashed object, weapons drawn, faces tense. The images were linked to Brazil's most secretive cases, including the Varginha incident and the death of Officer Marco Ili Xereze. Officials denied everything, but the footage tells a different story, and what followed was never meant for the public to see. Boas spots a UFO. In the cool October nights of 1957, long before alien abduction became part of pop culture, 23-year-old Brazilian farmer Antonio Boas first encountered something extraordinary above the quiet fields of São Francisco de Sales, Minas Gerais. Living and working on his family's farm, Antonio often plowed at night to escape the sweltering daytime heat. On the evening of October 5th, after returning to his home around 11 p.m., he stepped to the window to let in some air and was stunned to see a bright, fluorescent silver light hovering above the family yard. The glow was intense and seemed to have no visible source, bathing a large patch of ground in an unnatural illumination. Intrigued and unsettled, he watched as the light slowly moved toward the farmhouse, casting shadows through the roof tiles and the cracks in the shutters, while his brother João looked on before it suddenly vanished into the night. 9 days later, on October 14th, Boas was working late with one of his brothers when something even stranger happened. Around 9:30 p.m., as they plowed a field, an intensely bright red light appeared above them, so glaring that it hurt their eyes to look at it directly. The light hovered in the sky, roughly 100 meters above the ground, illuminating the field below with the eerie glow. Curious, Antonio left the tractor to approach the source, but each time he drew near, the light would jump to another part of the field, as if it was evading his attempts to get closer. He pursued it across the ground about 20 times, but the light kept on shifting its position, always staying just out of reach. After this strange chase, the light sometimes emitted rays in all directions, and then just went out, disappearing as abruptly as it had appeared. The following night, October 15th, when he was again alone in the fields, the encounter escalated. Around 1 a.m., Boas noticed what he first thought was a red star in the clear sky. But unlike any star, this point of light began to grow, not fading with distance, but approaching him with a peculiar steadiness. Before long, its true form came to light, and he couldn't believe what happened next. It was a bright, elongated, egg-shaped object with a pale red glow that slowly descended toward him and hovered just tens of meters above the ground, bathing the surrounding dirt and crops in near-daylight brightness. This was just the beginning of one of the most talked-about alien abductions today, as Antonio didn't expect he would be taken by creatures he didn't know existed. Abduction of Boas. As Boas stared at the egg-shaped UFO in front of him, he quickly ran to his tractor and tried to get away. He hadn't expected that the engine and lights would suddenly die just moments after he tried to flee. He abandoned it and ran, only to be seized by 4 small figures clad in tight, thick gray jumpsuits and helmets that obscured all but their light blue eyes. These beings made strange bark-like noises as they overpowered him. They held him aloft and carried him toward the strange vessel that had just landed on his farm field that night. Dragged up a metallic, flexible ladder that extended down from a doorway like a bizarre drawbridge, Boas was hauled inside a ship unlike anything he'd ever seen. Once aboard, the exterior door shut behind him, and he didn't even see a frame or hinge. Once inside, he found Himself in a small, square chamber whose walls and ceilings were made completely out of polished metal and dotted with recessed square lights that were glowing with a uniform brightness. The environment struck him as clinical and alien, and there was no furniture or familiar object in his sight. He only saw smooth, reflective surfaces, and was in an atmosphere that felt strangely silent and intense. At first, the beings guided him with simple gestures through the narrow passage, and their movements were deliberate and calculated. One of them motioned for him to step through an open portal that led into a much larger, semi-oval room. Here, Vilas Boas saw a central column, and off to one side there was an oddly shaped table surrounded by stools made of a white metal. But he knew that he had never seen this kind of metal before. The lighting was the same with the first room's square fixtures, and he began to wonder what the purpose of this room was. In this room, Vilas Boas waited, while the alien beings communicated among themselves in their odd vocalizations, moving about with efficiency and purpose. He noticed details like the polished metal and uniform lighting, and this would later be part of the testimony he shared with investigators. Even stranger, he looked above one of the doorways that led deeper into the ship. On the doorway, there were strange red symbols floating a few inches from the frame. Investigators later suspected that this was an alien symbol because it didn't exist on Earth. Vilas Boas stood terrified and uncertain of what he had to face, but little did he know that this wasn't the end of his strange experience on the spaceship. Experience in the spaceship. Inside the strange, silent corridors of the craft, Vilas Boas suddenly found himself in a situation far beyond anything he'd ever imagined. After the beings had dragged him aboard, stripped him of his clothes, and covered his body in a clear, viscous liquid, the encounter took on an oddly clinical quality. According to his account, two of the entities used tube-like devices to draw what appeared to be blood from his chin. This was a procedure that he described as painless but also shocking, leaving small marks that a doctor later noticed. The room around him was bright and metallic, its surfaces polished and featureless except for odd red symbols floating above a doorway. Shapes he would later reproduce for investigators because their unfamiliar forms stuck vividly in his memory. Once this brief examination was over, Vilas Boas was left alone in a different compartment of the ship, a place that felt strangely sterile, yet unsettling. The walls were smooth, but this wasn't what held his attention. It was what came next. After a period of uneasy waiting, the silent stillness of the room was broken by a figure that was different from the beings that had brought him aboard. She was naked, her skin described as very pale, and her hair was long and almost white. Her eyes were large, slanted and blue, with features that looked different from a human. To Antonio, she seemed human, but she also felt different, as if she came from a dream. It almost seemed like he was in a dream. He lay there and couldn't react as she had her way with him. When it was over, she smiled, touched her belly, and then pointed to the sky. According to Antonio, she was probably suggesting that a child might result from their union, and that it would be raised beyond Earth. But after she left, that was not the end of his time on the spaceship, and he still explored more before they finally returned him to Earth. Being returned and aftermath. After what seemed like a long, surreal series of events aboard the strange craft, Antonio Vilas Boas was eventually led back toward the entrance by the beings that had seized him. Hours later, he found himself back on his farm, and he watched the object lift into the sky with shocking speed toward the south. The lights glowed brighter, and there was a low hum trailing behind it as it vanished into the darkness. For a moment, he stayed still and couldn't believe what had just happened to him. He tried to process the experience, but it almost felt like he was crazy. He glanced at his watch and realized, to his shock, that about 4 hours had passed since he had been taken from his field. He couldn't believe this, because when on that spaceship, it felt like he was taken away for days or weeks. Staggering back to his abandoned tractor, he found the battery disconnected, the machine silent and dead. It was as if the alien beings had turned it off so that he wouldn't be able to escape. The air was cool with the early approach of dawn. Weak and shaken, Vilas Boas simply sat for a moment before succumbing to overwhelming exhaustion. He slept most of the following day, only waking around 4:30 p.m., famished and disoriented, but he managed to eat a modest meal. In the nights that followed, his sleep was troubled. He kept dreaming about the strange encounter. It jerked him awake in fright, sometimes leaving him drenched in sweat. He found it hard for him to rest peacefully, and when he finally fell asleep, his slumber was fitful and full of uneasy memories. Throughout the first week, his body rebelled against him. Nausea settled in, headaches throbbed, and his appetite waned for days. On the second night after the incident, he started feeling a burning sensation in his eyes, and it became more intense by the following day. For the next month, he dealt with excessive drowsiness, drifting off during odd moments in the daytime and struggling to focus on routine tasks. Physical marks also started to appear. There were bruises on his body that seemed to swell and itch before healing into purple patches, and pale yellow spots that developed near the nose about 2 weeks after the event. These lingering marks puzzled Antonio, and he struggled with what to do. Looking for answers, he returned to the landing site the very next day to measure the 3 indentations left in the soil. He used the measurements to check the approximate size of the object that had hovered over his field. A few months later, when he couldn't finally understand what had happened to him, he decided to share his story with researchers and get his body checked by medical professionals. Interviews and evaluation. When Antonio Vilas Boas was ready to speak out about what happened to him that October night in 1957, it was journalist José Martin's curiosity that made his story widely known. Martin was gathering stories of unusual aerial phenomena in Brazil, and when he found out about what happened to Antonio, he arranged for the farmer to travel to Rio de Janeiro. This happened in February 1958, and he was taken to meet with Dr. Olavo T. Fontes, a physician and respected ufologist connected with the National School of Medicine in Brazil and the American research group APRO. Antonio's consultation with the doctor lasted over 4 hours, and the two men put Vilas Boas's testimony under a careful and probing spotlight. They recorded his recollections in full and conducted a detailed medical evaluation. Fontes was struck by the consistency and earnestness of Antonio's account. During questioning, he didn't contradict himself, and instead, he was uneasy yet honest about what he experienced. He didn't use any exaggerated language or mention any myths, and when he couldn't explain something fully, he admitted it. To Fontes, this was probably just a man trying to make sense of something strange that he had just experienced. But perhaps the most compelling part was the physical symptoms that Antonio exhibited following the incident. He had a cluster of ailments that persisted for weeks, like lingering headaches, overwhelming nausea, a burning sensation in his eyes, a loss of appetite, and unusual skin lesions. The skin lesions looked minor, but they took months to fade. When Fontes looked closer at Antonio's symptoms, he noticed that these looked like radiation-related effects. But these couldn't be established because they didn't carry out any blood or tissue tests. But many years later, an image of a strange UFO surrounded by the military caught a lot of attention. raising questions about whether this is the same spaceship that took Antonio. Military surrounds crashed UFO. The UFO community is on edge as a photograph suddenly appeared in their circles without content and spread faster than anyone expected. Shot at ground level in a quiet, leafless clearing, it showed armed soldiers forming a loose perimeter around a massive metallic object lying on its side. Two military trucks stood nearby with their engines idling, as if their drivers had been ordered to stop exactly where they were. The object itself dominated the frame. It was elongated, cylindrical, and blunt at both ends. Its dull gray surface scorched and peeled as if it had experienced extreme heat before it crashed. Whatever it was, it definitely wasn't a normal aircraft. According to accounts that surfaced soon after, the military had been alerted earlier that morning to an unidentified object that had fallen from the sky and came to rest in a rural area. Units were dispatched quickly, sealing off the site before civilians could approach. Soldiers were seen examining the hull, crouching near scorched seams and ruptured panels, while others scanned the tree line. There were no visible wings, markings, or clear propulsion system. The object looked engineered, but not in a way that observers could understand or explain. Within hours, the image was uploaded to several social media platforms by an unknown source. The original post was deleted, but copies multiplied almost instantly. Amateur analysts zoomed in on the surface details, pointing out unusual banding along the hull and what appeared to be layered materials fused together. The lack of rivets or welds raised immediate questions about how the object had been constructed. Military officials declined to comment, fueling speculation rather than containing it. As the image circulated, something stranger happened. A number of UFO researchers noticed that there were similarities between the crashed object and the elongated craft as described by Antonio Boas in 1957. Boas had encountered a cigar-shaped UFO with a smooth metallic exterior, and the proportions, seamless surface, and the absence of traditional fight features in the newly leaked photo seemed to be the same. For several hours, the story seemed to be following a familiar pattern. There was a military response, followed by a rapid military response, and then a sudden wall of silence. Then, reports emerged from nearby residents who said they had heard a low, vibrating hymn coming from the secured area just before dusk. What happened next was never meant to be seen. The object started to emit a faint glow along its length, and the scorched surface lit up in thin, pulsing lines. The soldiers backed away as the hum intensified. Without any warning, the craft lifted itself from the ground, hovering briefly as debris fell away from its underside. Then, in a controlled motion that suggested intent rather than malfunction, it accelerated upward and disappeared from their view. By the time the official statements were released, the site was empty. The object was gone, the questions were left unanswered, and the image remained as the only proof that something had happened there at all. But of course, there are still some questions and skepticism, as many wonder whether Antonio really experienced what he said he did. Skepticism and questions. From the moment Antonio Boas's story was shared, many people were fascinated, but many others also questioned it, and suspected that it was all a hoax. This was one of the earliest UFO abduction reports, but many point out that there was no physical evidence aside from his testimony and the physical symptoms that appeared afterward. That raises doubt about whether the story ever even happened. Skeptics argued that what he described could reflect a vivid hallucination, psychological phenomena, or even fabrication rather than an encounter with extraterrestrial beings. Suggestions ranged from ergot or toxin-induced hallucinations caused by substances that can occur in agricultural settings to the idea that the story was invented for attention at a time when UFO lore was beginning to take public shape. Suddenly, a controversial alternative examination came years later from a former CIA affiliate who claimed that the abduction was actually part of a psychological warfare experiment. He claimed that chemicals were sprayed and the entire scenario was staged to study human reactions. But there was no proof of his statements. Even among more serious researchers, there were methodological concerns about how Vilas Boas's account was recorded and promoted. His long interview with Dr. Olavo Fontes and journalist José Martins was conducted in a time and context when UFO research lacked standardized investigative protocols, and later critics noted that subsequent retellings often repeated details without rigorous verification. In the decades that followed, some analysts have argued that elements of the story, particularly the more sensational parts, may have been reshaped or embellished in retellings, making it difficult to separate the original experience from the narrative layers added by researchers and enthusiasts. Despite all these criticisms, Antonio's story remains iconic because he never actually recanted his account. It also came way before the other famous abduction narratives, so it couldn't be copied. But since there's no physical or photographic evidence, and Antonio is the only witness, the case is still unsolved by ufologists because it raises more questions than answers. When the military surrounded a crashed UFO, it reminded many of the same kind of UFO that Antonio Vilas Boas saw in 1957 before it suddenly took him away. Do you think he really had this encounter? Or was it another hoax? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. So, thanks for watching this video, and we will see you in the next one.